What's up, my miners of intelligence and consciousness? I'm Rick Brooks, and this is Rick's Mind. Today with me, I have Dr. Avi Loeb. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So, we've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I think the best way to do this is if you could give me a brief. I read your book, by the way. It was fantastic. Extraterrestrial was great. If you can kind of give the listeners a brief overview of, your life. And I knew you grew up on a farm in Israel, and you were in the Israeli military. But if you give us a brief overview of kind of your past, and then we can get into Oumuamua. But
Sure.
I'd like to start there.
Yeah, I do think it's important because my adulthood was shaped by my childhood. And I pretty much see science as an extension of my childhood curiosity. It's a great privilege to be able to ask questions. One of the most vivid memories from my childhood was at dinner. I would ask difficult questions, and the adults in the room would pretend that they know much more than they actually know in answering the question. I would be upset because it was obvious that they don't really know the answer. That was the good experience. The bad experience was when they would dismiss the question. And not even answer it. And what I try to fix that by becoming a scientist, so that I will be surrounded by like-minded people who are willing to ask questions and answer them using data, using evidence. And I must confess that even nowadays, when I speak to some of my colleagues, they dismiss a question because they don't know the answer to it, and they ridicule a discussion on some questions that we will discuss later. But at any event, I grew up on a farm, as you mentioned, and I used to collect eggs every afternoon, and that connected me to nature. I really admire nature. Every day since the pandemic started, I jog at 5 a.m. in the company of birds, ducks, rabbits, and wild turkeys, and I enjoy seeing the sunrise. Every day it's different. Today I saw the moon. It was really amazing. The connection to nature is deeply rooted in me because I wasn't a social animal when I grew up. I wasn't a city boy. I grew up on a farm, and I used to drive the tractor to the hills of the village, and I was mostly interested in philosophy. But then, as you mentioned, I was drafted to the military. That's obligatory in Israel, and I had two options: either to run in the fields with a gun attached to my back, or to do something closer to philosophy, which was studying physics. I was good at that, and I finished my PhD at age 24 in a military program called Talpiot, where you study physics and mathematics in a way that would help the defense of the country. And I developed a project that was funded by the US, and that brought me to the US. It was funded by the Strategic Defense Initiative back in the 1980s that Ronald Reagan initiated. And as a result of those visits to the US, I ended up being offered a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study, where Albert Einstein used to be a professor a few decades earlier. Of course, I couldn't turn it down. It's just like in The Godfather, that was an offer that I cannot refuse. It was conditioned on the fact that I'll switch to astrophysics, which was completely foreign to me. I didn't know much. And then I started studying astrophysics. I was surrounded in the company of very smart people that were very competitive. And of course, it was a difficult time for me to learn by myself the vocabulary while others are, already familiar. And I had to sort of invent myself. And it always reminded me of, there is a tale about Münchhausen, a German tale about Münchhausen that used to, he rode a horse and got into mud and then was able to pull himself out of the mud by his own hands, so to speak, which is impossible based on that. And so I had to sort of pull myself out of ignorance, knowing nothing about astrophysics, and invent myself as an astrophysicist. And it took me some years, but it offered me a great advantage of being able to actually define myself in a way that is not similar to anyone else. You see, so that helped in a way. And then I was offered a position at Harvard, and again I couldn't turn it down. And eventually I was given tenure in astrophysics there, and became the chair of the astronomy department there for 9 years, the longest serving chair between 2011 and 2020. And at that point, it became clear to me that even though I was married through an arranged marriage by circumstances. I didn't really initiate the move to go into astrophysics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually married to my true love because astrophysics offers some fundamental questions, philosophical questions that we can address using the scientific method. And so it sort of completed a full circle for me, coming back to deep philosophical questions, but now as a scientist. And I established, for example, in 2016, a center called the Black Hole Initiative at Harvard, where I brought together scientists and philosophers that talk to each other.
Oh yeah, that's amazing that you're bringing those two worlds together, because one, that the philosophical world, they spend most of their time in their heads, and in the scientific world, the hard sciences, you're trying to bring those thoughts into the real world and use that in a way that would better humanity. So I think that's
Yeah.
awesome that you did that.
Well, I should say there is an irony in this because if you go 4 centuries back, there was this story about Galileo Galilei that argued that maybe the Earth moves around the sun and we are not at the center of the universe. And the philosophers at the time, of course, believed that we are at the center of the universe, just like my daughters believe that they are at the center of the universe when they were young. and the philosophers were quite brutal. They were not just nice people, at the time, because they had the power. And so they said, we don't want to look through your telescope. We know that the sun moves around the Earth. And then they put him in house arrest.
Yep.
Today, they would have canceled him on social media, obviously.
Yep. Yeah.
So the point is, philosophy at that point objected the scientific approach which Galileo founded, which was based on evidence. Look through my telescope and figure out the answer, he said. But they said, no, we know the answer. We don't need to look through a telescope. And they put him in house arrest. So now, to me, the lesson from this story 4 centuries later is we should find the answers by looking through our telescopes. Now, you might think, okay, 4 centuries have passed and everyone would understand that because modern science is supposed to be based on evidence. But what I find is exactly the opposite attitude still. There was, we will talk about this object, Oumuamua, and, several months ago, there was an article published in the magazine Nature Astronomy, a very prestigious magazine. It was written by philosophers who argued that Oumuamua, this strange object, must be natural, not artificial, based on philosophical reasoning. And that paper was accepted for publication in a prestigious journal. And I asked myself, how is it possible? Haven't we learned something over 4 centuries of practicing science that we should look for evidence? So through empirical evidence rather than rely on our mind to give us the answer. And the other thing you see is in physics, in the mainstream of physics, people have all kinds of speculations about extra dimensions, about the string theory landscape, about the multiverse that have no support whatsoever by any experimental evidence. And nevertheless, it's mainstream. So to me, it sounds like a betrayal of the tradition of Galileo. And I see it coming back now because, people are attached to themselves.
They're
Yeah.
100. They're attached to themselves and their ideas, and what I see. And again, I'm a layman. I want to just put that right out there. I'm a big dummy, right? I'm kind of a meathead. But like for what I see is a lot of ego, and people are obsessed with looking really, really smart on when you have these abstract ideas, like, oh, look at me, I did this. But when someone such as yourself comes up with some very interesting data about Oumuamua, everyone rejects it. And I think part of that is that people are scared of what the implications of that are, and the fact that we are, if you look at the math, right, it's almost statistically impossible that we're the only like life forms in the universe. It's ridiculous, but it's something that we're holding on to. And part of that is we are dealing with 1.5 million year old software in our brains. And that's a really big and scary concept, to think that we might not be alone, but we might actually be at the dumber end of the spectrum of what's completely possible in the universe. I
Yeah.
mean, the difference between us and a chimpanzee, I think, is 1% difference in intelligence. I could be wrong there, but something like that. And then if you look at it from the other end of the spectrum, something's 1% smarter than we are. That means that their children would be doing advanced mathematics and writing symphonies when they're like 2 years old, like, just to put it in perspective.
Yeah, you're completely right. And actually, we now know that something that we haven't known before, that over the past year, it became clear that about half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. And so what we see in our backyard, the Earth-Sun system, is not unusual. And why should we believe that we are privileged in any way? Galileo started this process to demonstrate that we are not privileged. We're not at the center of the universe. We actually move around the sun. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, space missions are based on that. Nobody would dispute that fact, even though it was popular at the time of Galileo that the Earth is at the center, and that's what the philosophers thought. But nobody remembers those guys when we launch space missions. It's completely irrelevant. Reality is whatever it is. So only for a little while you can maintain your ignorance, but eventually it will, come out the way it is. And so if we don't look through our windows for any neighbors, they will not go away. They are still out there. Mm-hmm. And so that's my basic point. We should pay attention to evidence. And the other thing is, when I teach at Harvard, for example, a freshman seminar, the first-year students that come to Harvard, they think that they're extremely smart. And I tell them, that half of them are below the median in the class. And they refuse to believe that. They get very upset. But this is a statistical fact that the median is defined such that half of the people in the class are below it. That's the definition of the median. So I tell them, half of you are below the median of this class. And they cannot believe it. Now, what's the lesson of that? The moral of that is, if we are one out of many civilizations, technological civilizations that existed since the Big Bang, around, and that is a very likely proposition. Maybe many of them have died by now, but, I'm just looking at the entire history. If we are one out of many, we're most likely in the middle of the distribution in terms of our intelligence, and therefore we should be modest. You know what? I mean, obviously, it's a problem for our ego. For example, if the Perseverance rover, which is now on the surface of Mars, we are happy for it to look for evidence that there were microbes on the surface of Mars because we can feel superior relative to these microbes. They're not intelligent. But imagine it bumping into the wreckage of a very sophisticated spaceship that had technologies far better than what we can develop. That would be a blow to our ego. It will make a lot of people upset. And, I understand that much of the pushback against my work has to do with the ego of people. Yep. The other part is people want to pretend that they're experts. It's just like those adults in the room that I described at the beginning. They want to argue that everything we see conforms with what they already know. So they are the expert in the field. And if you tell them, look, there is something that doesn't really, like Oumuamua, doesn't really look like a comet or an asteroid that you have seen before, they say, no. It's a natural object, because they want to maintain their reputation as the experts. If there is something that doesn't quite match what they already know, again, and they didn't discover it, they would be upset about it because apparently they missed something important about reality.
Absolutely. And it doesn't fit their narrative for what their life and honestly, real quick, it would potentially require a new set of physics that we do not have the answer to, which we need new physics. Anyways, if we were going to get off this rock, if you look at the Commander David Fravor, him chasing that Tic Tac, that's a new set of physics. Like, if that's real, that is a new set of physics that we don't have the answers to yet. What was that, John? What did you say?
Oh, I was just going to add, like, speaking of physics, like, I am a personally just like a big fan of physics, and I've read for a long time. There was a Portuguese physicist, and I can't recall his name, but he was coming up with a theory called variable light speed theory that accounted for the laws of physics, especially being the limits of what light speed would be, are different relative to what position in the universe you are based on any number of factors. And it just seems like anytime you're butting up against new discoveries, the laws of physics break down, that they have to keep being expanded or rethought, and people are too stuck in their own mindset to do it.
100%.
There are many things we don't understand. We don't know what happened before the Big Bang, before the universe started the way we see it. We don't understand what is the dark matter. Most of the matter in the universe, we don't know what it is. We call it dark matter just for a lack of a better understanding. And then there is, for example, a question about what's in the middle of a black hole that we don't know the answer to. And there are lots of fundamental questions to which we don't know the answer. And it's possible that they know the answer. And what we will meet, the encounter that we will have, would represent for us something magical, because they are far more advanced than we are. And, I wrote a Scientific American article talking about the possibility that they might even be able to produce a baby universe. And meeting them or meeting some technological equipment that was developed by another civilization that is far more advanced than we are may look like an approximation to God, because those things that they developed could be for us like magic. They could produce in principle things that we attributed to God. They could, for example, their technologies could have produced life, could have produced a baby universe, things that are mentioned in religious scripts. And so my point of view is we should stay modest and just look at the evidence, basically collect as much data in the sky as possible. Now, my friends, they say, no, until you show us extraordinary evidence, we do not want to fund this search because it's speculative. And my point is, first of all, we already funded for 40 years the search for dark matter, for specific types of dark matter, invested hundreds of millions of dollars, didn't find anything. That was part of the mainstream. So if we invest in searching for technological relics, to which there is some hints, there was a report from the Director of National Intelligence to Congress on the 25th of June, talking about objects whose nature is unclear. There was Oumuamua, this first interstellar object that looked very weird. I'm saying we should examine the sky and see if there are objects. We haven't done that. There was no funding to that. And if we invest hundreds of millions of dollars in this search and we don't find anything for 40 years, we would be at exactly the same point as the search for dark matter is right now. Yeah. So how can that be mainstream and the other thing is speculative and we shouldn't even discuss it? Mm-hmm. Given the fact that the public is extremely interested in this question and it would have a huge impact on society. To me, it's just really strange to see the situation right now. And my hope is that, with my advocacy, I will be able to bring it into the mainstream. And you may ask, how is it that I was willing to face all this scrutiny and pushback and so forth? Well, the truth is that a few years ago, both my parents passed away. And at that point, it became obvious to me that, we live for a very short time. And we better not put makeup and so that it makes us look better and rather than maintain our authenticity. And to me, there are some basic questions like, are we alone, which we must address, that we cannot just pretend that it's a question for which we need extraordinary evidence before we even discuss it. And the point is that a lot of people live their life with a question like that, that they say, okay, let's postpone it to the future, and then they die, just like pomegranate, full of seeds that were never planted.
Pomegranate, yeah.
Pomegranate. And my point is, all these hopes to all of our wishes that were never realized during our life get buried in the ground, right? So my point is, let's think about space. Let's look up, and then find our future in space, rather than bury everything that we really care about with us, with our bodies, when we end our life. And so the point is, space is vast. What you see are, for example, you see Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, using their wealth to lift their body by 1% of the Earth radius. That's what they did recently over the summer, and they're very proud of themselves. My point is, bragging or showing off in space is an oxymoron. You can't just be proud of yourself because you lifted your body by 1% of the Earth radius, because the universe is 10 to the power 19 times bigger than the Earth radius. It's huge. And, maybe if you cross the galaxy, you can say, okay, I achieved something really significant. So my point is, we should approach space with a modest perspective, not brag. I can give you another example. We sent on the New Horizons mission that went to Pluto, we put the ashes, 30 grams, 1 ounce of the ashes of Clyde Tombaugh, the guy that discovered Pluto, were put on the New Horizons spacecraft.
Oh,
that's
cool.
what NASA did. Now, this makes no sense whatsoever, because what are ashes? Ashes are burnt up DNA. So you take the genetic information of Clyde Tombaugh that you want to commemorate, then you burn up all the information, you make the ashes. Now, these ashes are no different from the ashes of a cigarette. So you put something that has no content, no information content, on a spacecraft. Now, if extraterrestrials would find that, it would be really embarrassing, because they would recognize a ritual that we do that makes no sense, which is to commemorate a person by erasing the genetic information about that person. It would make much more sense.
I've never thought about it. I thought it was kind of cool. I thought, that's kind of sweet. They sent the dude that discovered. I've never thought about it from your
Well, it would
point of
make
view.
much more sense to take the genetic information and put it in electronic form, on a disk or something, on the spacecraft, so that they can reconstruct that person, or take a stem cell and put it. Instead, we burned up the information, and then we send it as if we celebrate the discovery of this person. So, I would much rather now, given that we did that already, we need to develop a much faster spacecraft that will, go in front of New Horizons, so that anyone out there will realize that we are actually smarter than that.
100%.
They will see that first.
And I want to use this, because we're having a lot of fun. We're going all over the place, and I love it. But I want to bring it back to I keep mispronouncing Oumuamua. And I want to see, when you discovered it, what did you find peculiar about it, and what made you think that this is something completely different than an asteroid, just for our listeners that aren't familiar with the story?
Right. So this was the first object that came from outside the solar system that we discovered near Earth. And we knew that it came from outside because it moved too fast to be bound to the sun. And I didn't have an agenda about it. I very much would have preferred that it would have been a rock, because I wrote the first scientific paper, basically forecasting how many rocks we should see from other stars in our vicinity. So I expected it to be a rock that was ejected from another star, but then it started looking weirder and weirder as time went on. First of all, it didn't have any cometary tail. There was no dust or gas around it. We couldn't see it, and also the Spitzer Space Telescope put very tight limits on any carbon-based molecule, so it was definitely not a comet. A comet is a rock that is covered with ice that gets warmed up when it comes close to the sun, so the ice evaporates, you get this cometary tail. There was nothing of that type. So it was definitely not a comet. And then as it was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. And that meant that the object has a very extreme shape. And the best fit to the variation of light was that of a flat object, a pancake-like object, which again is very unusual. And then it exhibited an excess push away from the sun. And that push could not have been explained by cometary evaporation, by the rocket effect pushing it. So the only way I could explain it was the reflection of sunlight from its surface. And actually, a year ago, there was another object discovered by the same telescope in Hawaii that discovered Oumuamua. And by the way, Oumuamua means a scout in the Hawaiian language.
Ooh, I like that.
So the same telescope that discovered Oumuamua discovered another object near Earth that exhibited an excess push away from the sun by reflecting sunlight, no cometary tail, so exactly the same qualities. And then the astronomers, within a few weeks, realized it actually came from Earth based on its trajectory. And it's a rocket booster that was launched in 1966. It was given the name 2020 SO before that was realized. And that illustrates two things. One, that an artificial object that we produced, we know it for sure, behaved in ways that resemble Oumuamua. There was no cometary tail, and yet there was a push of the object away from the sun by reflection of sunlight. And the second is, this was a very thin object. It was not designed for the purpose of being pushed by sunlight, but it was just thin. And presumably Oumuamua was similar, but we know that we produced 2020 SO. The question is, who produced Oumuamua? And of course, we didn't get enough data about it. A picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words. The number of words in my book, Extraterrestrial, that I published, I wouldn't write the book if we had an image, a megapixel image of this object.
Yeah, and it's a like a cigar shaped object, correct? That's
Well, no. So it's cigar shaped when you look at it on the sky. So imagine a piece of paper. So if the piece of paper is tumbling, then when you look at it projected along your line of sight, it looks like a cigar when it's sideways. The piece of paper is sideways. But in reality, it was flat. That was the best. At the 90% confidence, that was the best fit to the variation of light.
It's so it's flat and it's accelerating, and that's what
Right.
it was accelerating past the Earth. No cometary tail. And so, my next question is: do we know where it's at now? Like, is it left? Are we still able to track this thing?
It will take it 10,000 years to leave the solar system.
Okay, so we're still watching it.
Big. But we cannot see it because it's a million times fainter than it was close to the sun by now. And we cannot chase it because it moves faster than any chemical rocket that we have. And so, but the key is to find more objects like it. When I go to the kitchen, I usually get alarmed when I see an ant, because there must be many more ants out there. So in much the same way, there should be more objects like it. And in fact, a few months ago, I established the Galileo Project. A few multi-billionaires came to the porch of my home and asked me questions about my book, and they were inspired by the vision. And together with one of them, Frank Laukian, I decided to establish the Galileo Project, which has two goals. One is to look for objects like Oumuamua and then study them much more carefully, take an image if possible. And the second part of this Galileo project is to look for unidentified aerial phenomena here on Earth, close to Earth, using new telescope systems, and uncover the nature of these unidentified objects. Basically, identify the unidentified. I received about $2 million within a few weeks in July and established this project. By now, there are almost 100 people involved in it, and it's the first scientific project. There are excellent scientists, mostly astronomers, it's the first time that scientists come together to collect scientific data and use a rigorous scientific approach to the study of unidentified aerial phenomena, for example. And that's a milestone. And by the way, over the past few days, I get a flood of requests from people interested in contributing to the project in terms of their expertise. And my goal is, again, to bring this subject to the mainstream of the scientific community. And I'm getting funded by money that was not used for science before. These are private sector donors that are excited, mostly high-tech people, excited about the vision in my book, and they gave me money. And there are lots of young people very excited about the subject. And really, the acidic atmosphere, the fact that there was ridicule and stigma on discussions on this topic, that's what prevented young people from entering, because everyone cares about this question.
Yeah, everyone does care, and if you're a millennial like myself, you grew up watching great science fiction. I know. From your book, you hate science fiction, especially if it violates the laws of physics. I'm not as smart as you, so I love it all. But that my curiosity has always been it's been out there. If you go out in the middle of nowhere, like I was in the Mount Hood National Forest, not a lot of light pollution. I was just looking up at the stars, and just you feel so small, and it's never made sense to me. There's a lot of things that don't make, like the Big Bang doesn't make sense to me either. I'm like, that just seems ridiculous. But I mean, it does. It's a little out there. It just
we don't know what happened before, by the way. That's one of the open questions.
Yes, exactly.
If you do establish contact, that's one of the first questions I want to ask. Do you know what was there before the Big Bang?
That's because that's always it's like science and religion. There's these two things. Like you've got the idea of God and that He's always been here, and I'm like, well, that sounds kind of ridiculous to me. And then on the scientific side, there was a Big Bang, and the universe was the size of a pinprick, and then it exploded, and there was all. And I was like, that sounds just as equally ridiculous to me as well. So
I think. By the way, there is a connection between religion and science. In the sense that, it's possible that what we find here on Earth can be created in the laboratory of a very advanced civilization. And then, it will be what we call God, in a sense, because they are much more capable than us. And,
absolutely.
And so, that is one way to marry science and technology, a very advanced level of science and technology, much more than we possess, with the philosophy of religion. And, perhaps what we call God is an approximation to a very advanced scientific civilization.
And I'm with you. There's a few things I want to get to. I definitely loved that you put panspermia in your book. That's something are you familiar with Terence McKenna by chance? He's a crazy person. He's like a psychedelic explorer, did a bunch of drugs, and he had to listen. He's a crazy man, but he had some very interesting thoughts. And one of his thoughts, I'm going to butcher this. It's basically, he's like, the Earth to him, he's like, there are two choices for humanity. One is that we become stewards of the Earth, stop messing it up with polluting it, and become masters. The other is we destroy it, and we use the Earth as an egg to spread throughout the galaxy. And those are the two choices we have. And I kind of, he also, I think there was another theory he had, and this couldn't be him. It might not be him, but I think it's like the theory of like mushrooms, right? He thinks that since they're a fungus, that maybe some of them survived through an asteroid, crashed into the Earth, and were able to spread, and they've been spreading through the universe like that. Or potentially bacteria. There's I believe Martian rocks that we found in Antarctica that have never reached I'm losing it right here, but they haven't been
heated by more than 40 degrees. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, both ideas that you mentioned, that we humanity should aspire to not to keep all its eggs in one basket and basically spread them. And the second is that nature itself could have spread life, through rocks that kept bacteria or fungus or whatever alive on the journey and spread them from one planet to another. Both of these ideas I completely agree with. And, so this demonstrates the point that, people that do not have training in science could come across the correct ideas.
That's very
Scientists that have training in science can go along, can take the wrong exits in the highway, go into dead alleys and just make them sort of popular among themselves, but they have no relevance to society or they do not describe reality. So both situations are right. And so therefore, getting trained does not necessarily bring you to the right spot. What you need is common sense. I think that is the most important.
Exactly, but it makes a lot of sense. Like, especially the whole idea of panspermia. That's the one I'm like the most drawn to, because who are we to say? Like, we have ecosystems on our planet. Who's not to say that the entire universe is one giant ecosystem of things, right? Or I'm going to just, in a way that I can understand it, like a giant organism or those types of things where you have destruction of stars and they explode and there might be bacteria on them, and then it goes to another planet or another world, and it figures out a way to survive. It adapts or it dies, and then it creates multi-celled organisms and things keep advancing. Like, who's not to say the universe has nothing but time? That's something that we don't understand. It's concept.
That's definitely possible. But one thing to keep in mind is that distances are vast. And
yes.
Even, if you use the fastest moving mediator, the messenger, which is light, that's the fastest messenger you can use. It takes tens of thousands of years for light to traverse just the Milky Way galaxy. And it takes 10 billion years to go across the universe. So these are very long time scales, and the distances are huge. So the point is, there is this paradox that Enrico Fermi, a very famous physicist,
Fermi paradox.
He went to lunch at Los Alamos and said they were talking about extraterrestrials, and he said, "Okay, well, it makes sense. Maybe they are out there, but if they're out there, where is everybody?" He said, "Where is everybody?" And since then, people said, "Okay, well, where is everybody? We don't see them, therefore they don't exist." Well, it's just like, sitting on the sofa at home and saying, "I don't hear a knock on my door, therefore I don't have neighbors." Like, okay, well, they might not be knocking on your door right now, but you definitely have neighbors, because the point is that recorded history is only 10,000 years old. And that's 1/1,000,000th of the age of the Earth. So if they visited us, let's say, 1,000,000 years ago, we would not know about it. If they visited us 1,000,000,000 years ago, they were only bacteria. They've never written a document they didn't write us a memo. Okay, someone visited us. So the point is just asking what Fermi asked, which is, modern science existed for several decades. We haven't seen anything. That's minuscule in terms of the window of time that we are looking. And actually, we didn't look very carefully. Like, for example, only in 2017, the first object from outside the solar system was spotted near Earth. Just think about it. It's only 5 years ago. And how dare we say that we don't have visitors if we are not able to find them? Like, this was an object the size of a football field that reflected sunlight. For the first time, we were able to find it within the Earth's orbit around the sun in 2017. Okay, that was the first case. So Fermi, like almost 70 years earlier, said, "Where is everybody?" Well, imagine that those things were passing through the solar system. We just didn't find them because there was no telescope surveying the sky. And Fermi can ask whatever he wants to ask, but the answer is sorry, you didn't build a good enough telescope to find those things. It reminds me of there was a tale about a story about a fisherman. A fisherman went to sea and said, he came back after several months and said, I discovered the new law of nature. The new law is all fish are bigger than 2 inches. That's a law of nature. So someone asked him, what is the size of the holes in your fishing net? And he said, 2 inches. So that is the origin of this law that he discovered. All the small fish went through the holes.
Yep.
And my point is, if Fermi didn't have Pan-STARRS telescope, obviously he would say, where is everybody? But once we constructed Pan-STARRS, we discovered something.
Mm-hmm. And you also have this disclosure of the Pentagon, those papers, and you have these incidents that keep happening, and now we're starting to study. And this is something that I'm very so happy that you've championing this, is because we need more data and we need it to be open to the public, and we need scientists to talk to each other. One of the things that I like to think about and I admire about you the most is you have an open mind. The mind is like a parachute. It only works if it's open. 100%. You have to have an open mind for all these possibilities. And in a lot of, and I've been like this in my life. If I get so concentrated on what's right, then I'm missing a completely different perspective of what could, or of a solution, right? That could just be to the left or to the right of me, but I keep looking straight ahead.
The way I see myself is slightly differently. I see myself as this kid that was saying the emperor has no clothes. Basically, I talk about what I see, and I have no reservations about things that look unusual, and I just say that they look unusual. And now my colleagues say, oh, Oumuamua was natural, but then when they try to explain those anomalies that I described, they always refer to something that we have never seen before, like a chunk of frozen hydrogen, a chunk of frozen nitrogen. And my point is that this resembles, a caveman finding a cell phone and then saying, the cell phone is just a rock of a type that I've never seen before. And of course, if he throws the cell phone, then that would be the end of it. And he would say there is no extraordinary evidence. Where is everybody? But if he looks at the cell phone and presses a button, he would realize that it records his voice, presses another button, he records his image, and then he will learn that it's not a rock. So my point is, very often in life, you have self-fulfilling prophecies. If you say, Oumuamua is a natural object, period, I don't want to discuss anything else. And by the way, I don't want to invest any funds in searching for unusual objects, then you will not find them. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a circular argument saying, we don't have any mail in our mailbox, and not even going to the mailbox to check. That it's a and unfortunately, that's exactly what the philosophers did during the days of Galileo. They said the sun moves around the earth, and they didn't bother to check. They didn't want to check by looking through Galileo's telescope.
Yep. And what a time it is for us to be alive, right? Where we find ourselves in a very similar situation, you in particular, right? In a very similar situation. And my hope is that the realization and the discovery that you are indeed correct and that we are not alone and we can get that verified could potentially usher us into a completely new era of understanding and an era of exploration. I like to think of Robert Oppenheimer at this point, because this is I think that a pretty good central message in your book is that we have to, and he echoed this after the atomic weapons, we have to start thinking in a different way. We have to evolve our thinking because we have these weapons of mass destruction now. And we cannot continue the same territorial disputes, the same bullshit that we've been doing forever. It has to stop. And if we're ever going to get off of this rock and advance and become a spacefaring race civilization, right? We've got to start thinking bigger. And we have got to start working together, and we've got to stop being scared of each other. We've got to stop wasting money, and we got to start pushing the boundaries of science in order to get there.
Yeah. So my take from human history, when I look at human history, what I see most of the time are groups of people trying to feel superior relative to other people,
Yep.
and the best example is the Second World War, where the Nazi regime triggered the death of 75 million people. That was 3% of the world population in 1940. It's 20 times more than COVID-19 caused, in terms of the death toll. So just think about it, 20 times more than COVID-19,
That's insane.
just by a group of people deciding to feel superior relative to other people. That makes no sense whatsoever. Now, what is my hope? My hope is if we find a smarter kid on the cosmic block, if we find another species that is far more advanced than we are, then all of our differences would look meaningless. All these reasons that people invented for saying that they are superior relative to others, all of these things would look completely meaningless. And my hope is that at that point, we will treat each other with respect as equal members of the human species. We will work together. That's really my hope. It will change the perspective. And as you said, we are wasting a lot of time fighting each other, and all of this would make very little sense if we find a smarter kid on the block.
Yeah, what is it? Ronald? Is it Reagan that said the only thing that would unite us would be if we were invaded by? That's a terrible Ronald Reagan impression, but aliens, So I'm 100% with you. What do you? I do have another question. I've got billions of them, but what do you say to the people that think that this is a piece of a planet flying through, or a piece of nitrogen ice? Like, that's just what do you say to the detractors?
Yeah, so for each of these possibilities, there is a problem. So there was a suggestion that maybe this object was a cloud of dust particles, very loosely bound, 100 times less dense than air. The problem with that is when it gets close to the sun, it gets heated by hundreds of degrees and will not maintain its integrity. Mm-hmm. Then there was a suggestion that it's a piece of a planet, as you said, that was broken off when the planet passed close to a star. And the problem is that you often get from such circumstances, you get cigar-shaped objects, not pancake-shaped objects. So that's the problem of that. And also the chance of that happening is very small. You need to pass really close to a star. And most of the planets or objects do not pass close to a star. Then there was a suggestion, maybe it's a chunk of frozen hydrogen, and then you can't see the hydrogen when it evaporates. And so it's a comet, but made of pure hydrogen. And the problem with that is hydrogen evaporates very quickly, so it wouldn't survive the journey through interstellar space. We actually wrote a paper showing that. And then there was a suggestion that maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg, that a chunk of frozen nitrogen that was chipped off the surface of a planet like Pluto. And the problem with that suggestion is that there is not enough nitrogen in the Milky Way galaxy. We wrote a paper that was accepted for publication showing that the mass budget, you just don't have enough nitrogen to make enough chips such that one of them would be Oumuamua. And actually, some of the advocates of these models admit that these models have serious difficulties. But my point is, all of them consider something that we have never seen before. And if we consider something that we've never seen before, then why not consider also an artificial origin? Just like in the story about the caveman.
Yep, 100%. And Occam's razor too. It's almost the most likely solution, right? Is that, especially with its gaining speed,
and especially with the 2020 SO, this object that was discovered a year ago by the same telescope and exhibited an excess push by reflecting sunlight with no cometary tail, turned out to be an object that we produced.
Exactly. So we've got two examples, two sets of data right now
from the same. Yeah,
I completely understand. So, I want to be respectful of your time. So, I want you to tell people where you're not on social media, are you? Good for you.
No,
good for you.
I promised my wife when we got married. She insisted that I will not have any social media footprint, and I agreed. And now I can see her wisdom. Except someone pointed out to me on Twitter that there was a science reporter that wrote that his wife has a crush on a scientist named Avi Loeb that she thinks is a sexier version of Anthony Fauci. And I mentioned
That's
it
too
to my
good.
wife. So I went to my wife and I said, look what was said about me." And my wife said, "Oh, that's a very low bar." So,
Man.
she always keeps things in perspective.
Yeah,
And
she knocked you down a peg, didn't she? Oh boy.
no, I mean, she may be right, but anyway.
So, but your book, where can people buy the book? Is it are you
Right.
working on any more books or?
Yeah, so the book is extraterrestrial and it's available everywhere where books are sold. And it's also translated to 25 languages by now. And yes, I'm working on a new book. I started recently, and hopefully I'll complete it within a year. That's the hope. And yeah, it will follow on the messages that we discussed, but they will offer some new material. And I will be glad to speak with you again once the book comes out.
I would love that. Yes, I would definitely. I would love to have you on again. You got to keep me posted on any developments that you're seeing in the sky. You got better eyes than I do, but I'll keep looking up. But you keep me
Well,
posted on.
we use telescopes, not people.
Yeah, I know.
Keep up with any news from the Galileo Project. We
I
hope
will.
there's something. Yeah.
I will. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.